Welcome to the Call House. Have you been to Fort Ross before? You may be a little surprised to see an American farmhouse as a museum here. Well, it's new. It's only been opened about 10 years. And we're very pleased to show you a house that some of our early settlers took over in 1873. 30 years or so after the Russians had left Fort Ross. George Call and his wife Mercedes came up from San Francisco and bought 2,500 acres of this lovely coastal land, which had been part of the Russian territory. And they were going to have a nice, quiet life in the country. They ended up staying here for 100 years almost. Their children lived in this house until they were in their 90s. When he built this house, he designed it himself. They came here in 1873 with their 4 little children. They didn't get the house built till 1878. As you can see, it's not a beautiful aesthetic building, but it's very practical and very sturdy and quite substantial. It's just almost exactly as George built it in 1878, except for one thing, this front door. This is the only modern thing in the house, except of course it's been electrified. There are 2 rooms on the porch. On the right is a guest room. The other room at the other end of the porch was George's office. He wanted to be right on the scene and keep a good eye on everything. And when the workmen came for their paychecks, that spittoon is for them. He wanted to be sure that they didn't bother his 6 daughters who were in here. He was very protective of his girls. So let's have a look at the house. So you come right into their sitting room. There's no entrance hall. And this is a room where they would gather in the evening. It was a room that they could close all the doors, keep it nice and warm. The fireplace is the only heat in the house except for the kitchen stove, but it helped. And you can see all the artifacts in here belong to the Call family. Mrs. Call's sewing machine right in front of the front window. She had the best view in the house. She had 9 children, but she had a lot of household help, and one of the things she did do, besides sort of supervise the children, she loved to sew, and so she would escape with her sewing. There's an Encyclopedia Britannica in the corner, and the children who were doing school papers were allowed to go and use it. It's quite a valuable encyclopedia. It's a Britannica from 1879, leather-bound, with annotations. It's one of the really nice things we have in the house. This is a really unusual telephone. Remember, this is 1870s, 1880s. There was a public telephone long distance from Eureka to San Francisco, but nobody else had telephones until the 1920s up here. So what the local people did was they set up their own system, and it was not electrically run. It was run by boxes like this. Each would have a magneto and a battery in them. People would have a box, and they would put the wires on the trees on their farms and insulators. These are own numbers, and their numbers were longs and shorts like Morse code. Let's call Elmer Brown. He lives about 15 miles away, way up on King Ridge Road, but he's a character, and we need to talk to him. Okay, first we'll ring. Okay, that's a long one, and that should get enough juice going that you can hear and talk. But sometimes what happens is you pick it up and you can't hear because it's a party line and everybody wants to know what's going on, and so they all pick up their phones and there's not enough energy that you can hear. So what you have to do is, would you please hang up? I need to talk to Elmer. And you hang up and you have to wait until everybody hangs up and then you can try again. It's not like a cell phone, is it? One of the few things that is not original with the family is the clock on the mantle. Somebody in the family took the originals. The chandelier is not the Calls, but it's almost exactly like the one they had in the room. So let's go look in the parlor. Next to the sitting room is the parlor. It was a very special room. People would have a parlor for special occasions if they had enough room in their house. And it was a room where the children were not allowed. There were sliding doors, and they were always shut. The children would come in if it were Christmas, if there were a special occasion. and to play the piano. There's also a back door to George Call's office in the parlor, so he could have a special meeting with an important business person in here and shut the doors. And his wife Mercedes could have a tea party with her friends on the sofa. But the most important thing in the parlor was the piano. It's a beautiful big square grand, and it came from Boston in 1873, and it was sent by their uncle Ambrose Call, who lived in Iowa. It was a present to the children, all 9 children, 6 girls, and they were afraid that they wouldn't have any culture here, so they sent a piano. Well, in 1878, when they sent it, it had to come from New Orleans by sailing ship, and it did, around the Horn of South America, up past San Francisco, up to our little deep water cove here at Fort Ross, and went up the loading chute and into a wagon in its box and came in to be put in the house. Well, the house was still being built, so they had left a wall unfinished, and the piano was moved in, and it's been there ever since. And the girls played, and it was a very successful thing for their social life. Remember, in these days, in the 1880s, 1890s, people made their own music. They didn't have phonographs and even all the modern things kids have now. And the young people played and sang a lot. They had their friends come up from San Francisco, sometimes on the train, and they would have dances in their barn. It was very important to them all. The furniture in this room is not exactly what the Calls had in their house in San Francisco, but it's just like it. The curtains were saved by one of the granddaughters in a trunk, and the pictures on the wall are of Stratford-upon-Avon, and they were in the attic of the house. It's nice to see how a family really lived, and that is why we've kept this museum not as a place where everything is under glass, but as if it looks as if maybe they just went out for a walk and everything is pretty much the way they left it. Now let's go back and see the bedrooms. This is a replica of the ship's captain's guest room, which was on the porch. People didn't hang out in their bedrooms. They were outside a lot, they were working, and their bedrooms were fairly small. There are a couple of really interesting things in this room. The first is this uniform, and Mrs. Call had put a note in the pocket that said, Captain Schaefer of the Mary C. The Mary C was the Calls motor sailor that they took to San Francisco from 1890 to 1910, and Captain Schaefer ran it. So this had been in the attic for over 100 years. It's very heavy because it's wool. They didn't have nice down jackets and those sorts of things, but it's a wonderful relic. And on the wall we have a mirror, has all the men's shaving things on it. It's a wonderful relic, and it's gimbaled. It's held on the wall with one nail, so that when it was rough at sea, things wouldn't spill. You'll also notice that there is a pitcher and a basin on the dresser under the window. Remember, this was a house without inside plumbing. When the Calls came here in the 1870s, there was no electricity anywhere, of course, and no water system, and they had to make do with all those things themselves and build up things that worked. And you washed in your rooms because they didn't have bathrooms the way we know them. This is the master bedroom, the parents' bedroom, and as George Call designed this front part of the house, he made sure that he and Mercedes had several nice things that other bedrooms didn't have. The back of the fireplace is in the bedroom, so they got some heat. There's no heat in any of the other bedrooms. And they have a closet. Closets were quite rare in the 1870s. They were expensive, and they didn't want to waste the space, so they could store their clothes in there. Hanging on the wall next to the closet are 2 things that belong to George and Mercedes. Mercedes' brown velvet traveling dress from the 1880s with bustles down the back. It wasn't very well worn because I think maybe she was pregnant a lot of the time. She had 9 children, you know, from the time she was 16 to the time she was 32. Next to the dress is George Washington Call's beaver hat, his bowler hat, and he wears that hat in every picture that is ever seen of him. We also have a wedding dress from their daughter Laura, one of their 6 daughters, She was married in 1907, and her daughter, Lori, gave it to us. Lori and her cousin Barbara are the two surviving grandchildren of the Calls. They're both 94, and they've been very generous and given us many things to have in the house. On the fireplace are some religious pictures. Mercedes was brought up a Roman Catholic. George, however, did not believe in religion of any kind and discouraged it, but she didn't pay any attention to him. So she had her own private devotions there. Shall we go into the nursery? This is where the littlest children slept, and this room is big enough to have a nursemaid in here with them. There are many nice things in this room, as you'll see. There are pictures from the attic. There's a boat on the wall, that the one the boys played with, and we know they played with it because the keel is weighted and it has a working rudder. The dolls, some of them belong to the Call family. The two in the bed are quite old. The old dresser with a very bad mirror, but it's original. A lovely quilt of Mrs. Call's, and that one has a particularly nice color scheme, I think. On the wall behind the quilts are some of their clothes. Now, they didn't have closets, so they hung their clothes on the wall with clothespins and cords. And there are petticoats there, and a corset cover, and a couple of babies' bibs. And these are all original pieces of clothing that the Call family has saved and given us to put in the house. In the corner are many books and games, also saved by the family. They're all over 100 years old. In the far back is actually a board game from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. There were lots of nice books, children's books, and one of them was a book in Spanish that Mercedes brought from Chile. She did not have much English when she came, and she made a real attempt to speak Spanish with her children, and the first 3 or 4 children were quite bilingual. And then they said she got tired of it after that, and just the oldest girls spoke Spanish. So this is the dining room where the family had all their meals. The Call family loved this room because of the nice light, and it was a very nice place to eat. As you can see, that's a big table. They had a big family of children. They always had a lot of visitors. There were the ship's captains, there were travelers, there were old friends. Mrs. Call loved to invite people to eat, and sometimes they said, well, it's because she didn't have to do all the cooking. Also in this room is the door to the attic, and next to the attic door is a pantry. It's the only other closet in the house, and they stored all their canned apples, sauce, and peaches, and all those things that they put up in the summer in glass jars. On the wall are 2 pictures. One of them is a religious picture. They probably put it up after George died, because I don't think he would have liked that. And there's another picture farther along the wall, a very patriotic picture of the first 3 assassinated presidents, Garfield, Lincoln, who was first, and McKinley, 1901. At the table, there are all the family's best dishes. There are Bavarian china of a pattern called Rose of Silesia. And also, if you'll notice by George's place at the end of the table, there's a funny old bottle. And that's special mineral water. And George had a digestive problem, so he had Hungarian mineral water shipped over from Europe just for his own use. At the end of the room is a redwood cabinet that the Calls had built by a local man. It has their extra dishes in it. And on the table we have photographs of all the 9 children when they were grown. They loved this place, and none of them left home till they were probably in their 30s. The kitchen is a pretty big room, but a lot of cooking went on in here. The first 30 years, of course, when they had a lot of shipping, there were a lot of people around, and they often would be cooking for 15 to 20 people a day. 3 meals a day, and everything from scratch. And they had a professional cook who lived in a little room outside, and she cooked everything on this old stove. Bread, pies, biscuits, everything had to be done from scratch. She was a very busy woman, you can be assured. The kitchen's pretty much the way it was when the last Calls left. The wood box was underneath the window, and one of the boys would chop a lot of kindling and put it through the window into the box. The windowsill is still chipped where they hit the window a lot. The cook was very particular about the stove wood. It had to be just the right size, some small for kindling and some bigger to last a while. And you can imagine that this stove was going a good part of the day. There was a great display of butter making equipment in the middle of the table. They had, around 1900, developed a big dairy up in the hill across the highway. They had almost 100 cows, quite a number of young men who milked, and these are some of the butter making things. There are 3 churns, different ages. They actually shipped tons of butter to San Francisco every year. We have the records, and they put it up in 2-pound blocks. The girls actually sewed these cheesecloth cases, and then they would put it in salt water in big barrels and ship it to San Francisco and sell it. And it was really their big cash crop. They made a great deal of money on their butter. Coffee came as raw beans in big gunny sacks, and you would toast it in the oven till it was nice and brown, and put it in a little hand grinder and grind it up. And then you'd get to make your coffee on the stove. It was not like going to Starbucks. If they had leftover cake or pie after dinner, they would leave it by the door. And then if the workmen or the boys got hungry, they could come in and help themselves. This sink was the only running water in the call house. In order to get water, they developed a spring up above the creek about a mile away. And they built a wooden flume down the hill to a tank just above the house. And so they had gravity feed running water in the kitchen. On the stove, they had a tank up above. And when the stove was going and it was hot, it would heat water up there. This is the back room of what was originally the old Russian storehouse. What they used this for at first was as a bathroom. And so we have an old bathtub on the wall. And a bathroom in those days was not what we would call a bathroom. It had only a bathtub in it. Everything else was very primitive and either outside or by a pitcher. And then when they got their dairy going up on the hill, they moved the bathtub into a real bathroom that they built and used this as a dining room for the young men who milked their cows. Now they had several of them, maybe a dozen. And some of them didn't have wives to cook for them, so they would come down from the dairy on the hill and eat all their 3 meals a day here. And there's a door outside, so they could go out and in and out and wash up out there and come in. And they just put everybody to eat in the big dining room, but they could sit and tell bad jokes and hoot and holler and not bother anyone. And the young boys in the Call family got to eat out here too, which they really liked. So you've seen all the house, and it's pretty comfortable, isn't it? Do you think maybe you'd like to move in? I don't know what the rent is. Well, there's a couple more things I'd like you to see, and one is the school. When the Calls came in 1873, they had little children and there was no school around. So their solution was to build a school and hire a teacher, which they did. The teacher lived in their hotel in the old Russian compound, and they paid her salary. They ran the school for 10 years just for their own children. After a while, George decided that it was really getting a little noisy over there. His children were disturbing his newspaper reading time. So he got the county to build a public school out on the cliff. George Call lived to almost 80 years old. He died in 1907. And when he died, he had a very tight will, which surprised everyone and very much held up. It said that his land could not be sold until his last child died. And his youngest daughter, Mercedes, lived to be 98. So it was 1976 before the land was divided up. So that meant that the state park was able to buy enough that they now have over 2,000 acres in this beautiful park. See how open and lovely it is? George had taken the original 2,500 acres that he bought in 1873 and developed it into almost 8,000 acres. And it went from the farm down on the cliff there, you can see the white buildings, up onto the ridge and all the way up to Seaview Road and all along the coast to Culmer Gulch. And that's still pretty much what the park has. It's a beautiful piece of land, and the people of California are, I think, quite grateful for it. The surprising thing is that one of George's granddaughters told us that he all along had hoped that the park would be able to have it all. He was a very quiet and very self-contained man, and he never told anyone that while he was alive, but I think he would be pleased. Thanks for coming. I'm glad you were able to see the house because we certainly have enjoyed putting it together. And on your way out, if you didn't notice before, please have a look at the garden. You're welcome to walk around in its little paths. The garden was a very important part of this establishment. Mrs. Call was a great gardener, and many of the plants that are in there were hers, even though she's been dead for almost 80 years. We make a real effort to keep the things we think she would have liked. So enjoy the rest of your trip and your visit on the coast and come back again.